This is Ship It with Justin Garrison and Autumn Nash, a podcast about everything that happens after Git push. Ship It is brought to you by Fly.io, the home of changelog.com. Launch your apps close to your users all around the world. Learn how at Fly.io.
Hello and welcome to the Ship It podcast. I am your host, Justin Garrison, and with me as always is my co-host, Autumn Nash. How's it going, Autumn?
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing just fine. I am looking forward to meeting you in person next week. As we're recording this, it's a week behind where we're going to launch it because Autumn and I will both be giving talks at Southern California Linux Expo. If you missed it, I'm sorry. If you came and said hi to us, thank you. Hopefully you had a good time and got some swag and were able to attend our talks.
Are you really going to withhold socks? Because I feel like you should give socks to your friends.
I think I have enough socks for you. I do have some swag. I got some stickers for various things. I'm one of the organizers for KCD LA, so I have stickers for that. I have stickers for my job. I have some socks for my job. I got stickers for the Linux distro I help with. There's a lot of stuff. I'm just bringing boxes of stuff and hopefully not coming home with it.
By the end of the conference, you're going to be like, everybody take this stuff so we don't have to take it home with us.
This is life in DevRel, yes. And so usually when you travel to a conference, you want everyone to take everything so you don't have to ship it back.
That's crazy.
But in this case, it's local for me. So I would just put it in my trunk and drive home.
Hope you clean out your car before this weekend.
On today's show, we have an interview with Andy Glover. And Andy used to be part of the productivity engineering team at Netflix, which is an awesome topic to me because I used to be part of a productivity engineering team at Disney+. And so we had a great conversation, not just about productivity engineering, but about platform engineering and just in general, like how Netflix has grown over time using the cloud and all sorts of things. It was a really fun just conversation that we went a little long on, which was fine. I think we both had a good time.
It was adorable because you guys were like rival companies, but like on the same track. And it was great.
It's fun when you kind of do the same thing in different environments because you learn a lot from someone else. And even though I don't work at Disney Plus and he doesn't work at Netflix, it was also
a really great time to work in both those areas.
Yeah. The 20 teens timeframe and even early 2020 was like there was a lot changing in streaming, and now in 2024 there's a lot of regret.
A lot of good lessons learned. You got to be positive.
Yeah, I actually tried to sign up for cable like a month ago, and I didn't even realize like there's no one local anymore. Like it's like an outsourced thing that like it was a weird situation that I was like, wait, I can't just get like a cable. Like no. You're bundling everything. Like if you want to come over to cable, we are now your cell provider. We are your password manager. We are everything. I'm like, I don't think I want to bundle that much. I just want a cable.
Yeah, I'm good.
So unfortunately, this is where we're at in 2024. As always with the show, we wanted to start off with some articles that we found interesting. Sometimes software and, general Ship It related items, sometimes not. This time I will go first with an article I found called Maybe You Don't Need SRE. I very much like this article because part of my title at Disney Plus was SRE. It was a very long title. It was weird. But I was technically like platform engineering, SRE, productivity engineering. I don't know. But SRE in general as a thing is weird. And this article was from someone that used to be SRE at Google. And they talk about all of here's what it says in the SRE book, and here's how it was implemented, and maybe you don't need these things.
That was wild when I saw that article on Twitter because it was like, for one, it's just so cool for people to be honest, like, how sometimes when things get popular, it becomes like the holy grail and like people want to implement it everywhere. And what you need at Google, you don't need at a small startup. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
They're not always valuable in each situation. It's really use case depending. Like if it's a huge enterprise, is going to have different needs than a small company. At the same time, like it was just like, wow, like people that wrote this book were like, you really don't need half of this. I was like, that was a little crazy.
And specifically in this article, I found it really cool how they call out something that when I read the SRE book, I was like, wait a minute, the SRE team at Google controls budget from the application teams. Like they literally like, you will not have an engineer because you are paying us to do your ops work, essentially.
Oh, I did not know that, dude.
And that was like a big leverage that they could say, hey, if you don't make the software good enough, then we're going to leave and you have to run it yourself and you don't get SRE anymore. And there was this big political power of what SRE inside of Google, at least what the book states it has, and what most people that implement SRE have, because from my experience, SRE kind of evolved out of this. Sysadmins became DevOps engineers who then became SRE.
Isn't it funny how that's done that crazy transition? Like then they're like DevOps is dead, and then they're like SRE, like
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of that was to keep up with pay rates, right? Because in many cases, like your sysadmin was not making very much money and they weren't even seen as the same tier as a developer, as an application developer. They weren't writing code. They were running systems and they were basically managing tickets and to some extent a support desk. They're help desk. They're just help desk that has SSH keys, right? Like at some level. And then DevOps came along and like, oh, we're working with the dev teams. We're not just reactive. And in this article too, they point out that like SRE work should not be reactive. SRE work should be, future looking development, like actual software development. This toil that you're working on should be handled as a software problem, not as a systems or a process problem. And so, yeah, the article in general, again, lots of neat things, mainly around the things that I really liked were around those power dynamics of what does the SRE team actually do inside of your company and how much leverage do they have? Because if they are completely separate from the dev teams, if the budgets are separate, and if it's a junior-ish team, which they point out in here where a lot of these teams are new and they don't have political capital, so they can't work on good projects, and then people leave because they get bored, and that cycle happens.
Isn't that crazy how that's like a literal thing you have to call out? Like nobody thinks about that kind of stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I found it really good. I agreed with pretty much all of it, where SREs that I've seen implemented, especially at large organizations, just ends up being like this pseudo sysadmin team that maybe gets paid a little better, but has no more power than they used to have.
Is the on-call terrible for SRE?
It really depends on the company, is my opinion on that. Like I was a systems engineer at Disney Animation and I never was on call. We didn't have an on-call rotation because we never had a public service.
Yeah.
We never had like a thing that was like, oh, we don't even run a website. Like that's not us. Like we outsource that thing. And so like, as I was transitioning out of there, we did have like, oh, we should know who to call if something happens. But all of our customers basically worked the same time that we worked. And if we weren't there, like it was like the customers weren't there either in most cases. So, but Disney Plus was absolutely different. It was really nice being on the team and working with some of the people, like with the run books were actually really good there. But in general, like I don't like being paged at night
Yeah.
or at kids' birthday parties. And I have pictures of me being paged at Disneyland and I brought my laptop and we sit down and we fix it.
That's a bummer.
It's a lot of fun, but in general, like SRE is usually just like the ops person for the dev team. And in this article, they definitely point out like the SRE team should be software engineers and they should not be managing the dev ops team. And it also points out in here how platform teams play in there, because SRE is not platform.
Which is also really interesting because I feel like these terms get floated around, but nobody really talks about like the web of how they relate to each other. So I think that's really cool because, when you go to school for computer science, you're just like, I'm going to be an engineer, but what type of engineer? You know what I mean? Like people don't even know. Like I remember when I went into the solutions architect interview, I had to Google what a solutions architect was because I was like, I just thought I was going to be an engineer when I graduated with this degree,
Yeah. To that extent, like they're not all defined at the same, even at the same company, right? Like if you go to any large enterprise and it's like, oh, what is SRE? It's like, well, what division are you in? Because that's going to have a different meaning.
Yeah, it's wild. Like just like being a solutions architect, you can be a specialist versus a generalist, and they're very different jobs. Like you can be on the service team, you can be. But it's also like, I think these things are really cool because you can't want to be something if you don't know it exists, right? Like, so I think when people talk about like, what's a TAM, what's a solutions architect, what's a SRE, what's DevOps, you know that it's out there and it becomes an obtainable goal.
But also none of these job titles existed when I was a kid. When I really think about that, because they get rebranded and things change. And
not even as a kid though. Have you ever got a job and you were like, this is my like dream job, and then like eventually you're like, okay, I've done it, like what do I want to do next? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like not even just as a kid, like you do DevRel now, you didn't start off in DevRel, but you're really good at it. So it's like your job as a systems engineer like prepared you for this, but it also like this is like a skill to be able to explain technology to people, and it's not a skill that everybody that's technical has, right?
Right.
So if you didn't know that existed.
Yeah. And sometimes, depending on when you're looking for a certain type of job, that job may not exist because the industry around it isn't, they're ready for it, or like the time has passed for it. Like there's so many things that we did in the 90s as like job titles that like there's just
Well, just think about like DBAs, and then we got managed databases and the cloud, you know what I mean? And we still have DBAs, but it's not as common as we did before because a lot of people don't manage their databases anymore.
Right. What you were doing as a DBA 20 years ago is probably very different than what you're doing as a DBA today.
Yes. That's kind of one of the cool things about our industry. You could be doing one thing. Like I know so many people who were like engineers and they're TAMs, or they started off here and they're something completely different later. And it's so cool that you get that. And also, like nobody talks about like getting into the industry and you're like super hyped. And then it's like, okay, and then where do you go? Like, how do you grow and like transition and pivot, because people just like, everyone is just wanting to be an engineer, but you have no idea what space you want to work in. Being like a front end engineer is very different than back end or platform, or so I think that's cool.
I really honestly think that working in a help desk helped me a lot identify some of that, because you get calls for all of the departments that are behind you that you support.
But it makes me so upset that people always want to say that's like a non-traditional. People are like, that's a non-traditional background, and da-da-da. And a lot of people have degrees that were working in the help desk, and they're like, dude, some of the best principals I know were either help desk people, like engineers, like cloud or support engineers, or they were test engineers, like like QA testers.
Yeah, QA.
Like they are the best. They will debug stuff in a way that you're just like, I didn't even know you could do that. And it's just like literally one of my favorite principals. She is just amazing, and she used to be a support engineer, and I'm just like, how can we like down that? Like people look down at people like, oh, you're like a non-traditional. And I'm like, they are badass. They can do the most amazing things with a terminal and find this problem. And I'm just like, teach me your ways.
I think one of my biggest realizations in at least the past couple of years is the fact that like, I don't think I ever left the help desk.
No, it's all troubleshooting. Most of being an engineer is trying to figure out where it went wrong. Like the whole time.
But yeah, like who I'm helping and who's calling me is different. It has changed. But in general, like the skills I learned in a help desk are still super valid.
And nobody's better than anybody. We're all trying to fix somebody's problem. You're all getting a ticket. You're all fixing it. You know what I mean? Like everybody is gonna like all hands in. It's like really well paid grunt work, and it's all the same.
Yeah.
Okay, so my link is, it's like Penn Live, I think. I think we've all seen it, but ex-Google worker stole AI secrets from China, according to the feds. But I just think that like it's wild. Like AI has got to the Department of Justice. Like, so apparently the Department of Justice uncovered that this person stole 500 confidential files from Google and sent it to China. But it's crazy. Like the Attorney General is commenting on tech, like,
I mean, I guess it depends on who you're stealing it for, right? Like if that went between companies, that's a, localization, like, or Supreme Court maybe, but yeah,
you're like, what were you doing? You know what I mean? And how much were they paying you, dude?
Yeah, I mean, like at some point, you have to trust the people you work with, and sometimes you say like, oh, we pay these people enough. And it's like, well, if someone else is going to pay them more, like people might just chase that still, and that is a scary.
Dude, you worked at Google.
Yeah.
Like, what did you need?
This actually reminds me of way back in when PGP or GPG came out. So the pretty good privacy, that's PGP. When it came out, like they had it and they had the software and they open sourced it. And the United States was coming after them for lawsuits. The person who wrote it, I forget his name, because it was security code, and security code was seen as munitions to be exported.
Oh, really?
And so you could not export it. And so he's like, it was open source, like it was available. The internet wasn't, a thing yet, but like we couldn't put it on a disk and give it to someone.
I never thought of open source in that context, because like I've only done it in the context of the internet and pulling things off GitHub. So that's wild. Open source back when you were like given disks. That's really cool.
Yeah, it was a physical disk, and they we cannot fly internationally with this because it is a munitions export according to the government. And so in order to get rid of all of the accusations and get past the rules that were in place, was he literally wrote a book with all of the source code in it, because there was still a provision that you could write code in a book and that would not be a export. And now that it was publicly available in the book, he could then put it on a disk and give it to someone.
First of all, can I just say that I love your random tidbits of information?
I just read it last week and it was amazing. I'm looking for that book now.
It makes my life like, we'll just like I won't see you for 3 days and then you're just like, guess what I did this weekend? And I'm like, I'm so here for it. Tell me. And then like your eyes get like the Justin like thing. And I'm just like, you know, when you know that your friend's about to tell you something, but it's going to be like good, right? Like you're just like, I'm so here for it.
I'm just glad that they're still good, because my kids don't think they're good. No one else that I'm talking to like in person or like, they're just like, what?
Oh, dude, my kids think I'm so lame. Like my kid was like, you're overprotective. And I was like, rude. I'm cool. I've got pink hair. Stop trying to like just like, why are you so offensive? Like I gave birth to you and I feed you. Like, okay, this is crazy. It carries a 10-year penalty and the fines are up to $250,000. And they like are basically saying that it illustrates the affiliations of companies based in the People's Republic of China and that they're willing to steal American innovation. But I'm just like, what was he doing and where was he stealing it for? Because like, dude, if he was just giving it to some tiny company, there's no way that they would have went after him like this. I was like, what were you trying to do with AI?
There's a lot of questions in there of like, where was he starting from? What did he work on? Where was the information going?
And they were so vague about it. I was like, oh, you did, like, we're going to find out about this later and it's going to be good. Like,
yeah.
Like, just like, I can't wait till there's a TV show about this. Some sort of documentary is going to be lit.
It'll be an episode of Silicon Valley or something like that.
No, I want one of those like CNBC, like American Greed. Those ones are so good. And like people do crazy stuff. They're like, dude takes his tiny plane, flies it into like lake, fakes his own death and comes back 10 years later. And you're like, damn, dude, like how bad were your problems?
Okay, another side. I literally just watched a documentary. It was an ESPN documentary about someone that in the late 90s, someone that bought the hockey team, the New York Islanders. And they're like, I'm going to buy them for $160 million. And here's my bank account. Here's my all this stuff. Like, I'm just going to go straight up buy them. They had no money. They did not have any of them. They forged all these documents.
Okay, as a brown person in America, you can go into a store and people will follow you or something that costs $5, but dude can walk in and just be like, I got like 160 mil.
It was back in the 90s too, so like it was hard to verify some stuff, but like he sent some faxes and is like, here's my budget and I want to buy the Islanders. And he was the legal owner of the team for like 4 weeks.
I have one for you that beats that.
What's that?
So there's this episode of American Greed. I may or may not have seen all of the ones on Hulu. Like, don't judge me in my crime obsession. But like, there was this dude and he was a brain surgeon or spinal, something that you like should not touch. Okay. And he faked all of it. Like he was in there just like literally making it so people couldn't walk, killing people. Like, first of all, the audacity. Who walks into an actual operating room and it's just like,
I got this.
Like for real, wouldn't you be like, oh, that sounds horrible. I wouldn't want to hurt somebody. Like the audacity that this man was like, I got it. Like, and just walked in playing with people's brains and stuff. Like, no big deal. Like, just murdering people. And then, like, nobody stopped him. Like, how, like, he went and, like, he did it so many times and, like, made it where people couldn't walk. People died. And I was like, y'all just let him do it to, like, a bunch of people. And you were like, oh, at some point we should, like what?
There's an opposite of that too. Like the podcast, the Darknet Diaries is all about like, you know, darker sides of the internet. And there's a company called Exact, which is basically like shut down because they had schools, multiple, like hundreds of schools that were quote unquote, training people to do different skills, but it was not legitimate schools. And they were not actually giving them training, but they would give them actual, like, here's your degree. And people could say, I have a degree from this school. And it's like, it's not real. None of it was real. And it was all a scam to be able to get people to like, hey, we're having problems with this thing. Can you pay us $500 so we can expedite this process? And like, they had like these courses made, but they weren't like real legitimate courses. And hundreds of thousands of people got quote unquote degrees from these schools from all different things. And they just started creating new and new schools. Every time they got found out, they would shut one down. They're like, oh, here's another one.
When they did that with the Art Institute, that's like one thing. I'm totally screenshotting our ridiculous faces, but like that's one thing. Okay, like I went to some crappy schools and like it was really, you're like, well, dude, like, and then I was like, I'm going, like, art school is not for me at this point. But like people's brains though, and like
at least the interview they were doing with someone, they would say like they had some areas that they would not give degrees for. And I think medical was one of them. He's like, no, we have morals. All right. Like,
oh, thank God. I was like, do we need to go like, they were like, this is our line.
but they would do it for like counseling, like school counselors and all these like people that it was just like, wait a minute. And it was like, you couldn't track it back to one school.
Do we just need to do like how do we like find all the people they gave fake degrees to?
I don't even know anymore. I don't like the whole degree system. I am confused.
This is the funny thing. Okay. Like being a woman and telling your friends to apply for jobs. They're like, I'm not qualified, even though I have 90% of this like application. And you're like, dude, there's people out here faking their whole life. Just apply. They'll tell you if you're not good at it. Like, just dude.
Well, that was quite a few different tangents, but really fun. And I think our conversation with Andy goes a lot of different ways too. So
I feel like we reined it in with our conversation with Andy because there was a whole 20 minutes before that. We did a good job. I feel like it could have been worse.
Yeah, we came back around and it's a great conversation. Everyone's going to love it. And it is very much more related to infrastructure and software than this conversation right now about education.
And crime. Don't forget the crime.
the true crime as well. So anyway, let's jump over to the conversation with Andy and then got a couple things after that.
What you're about to hear are real reactions from PagerDuty users in response to seeing signals from Fire Hydrant for the first time.
PagerDuty, I don't want to say they're evil, but they're an evil that we've had to maintain. I know all of our engineering teams, as well as myself, are interested in getting this moving the correct direction. As right now, just managing and maintaining our user seats has become problematic.
That's really good. Actually, this is a consistent problem for us and teams. Is that covering these sorts of ad hoc time frames is very difficult. Putting in like overrides and specific days and different new shifts is quite onerous.
Well, and you did the most important piece, which is didn't tie them together, because that's half the problem with PagerDuty, right? Is I get all these alerts and then I get an incident per alert. And generally speaking, when shit goes sideways, you get lots of alerts because lots of things are broken, but you only have one incident.
Yeah, I'm super impressed with that because being able to assign to different teams is an issue for us because like the one alert fires for one team and then it seems like to have to bounce around and it never does. Which then means that we have tons of communication issues because like people aren't updated.
No, I mean, to be open and honest, when can we switch?
So you're probably tired of alerting tools that feel more like a headache than a solution, right? Well, Signals from Fire Hydrant is the alerting and on-call tool designed for humans, not systems. Signals puts teams at the center, giving you the ultimate control over rules, policies, and schedules. No need to configure your services or do wonky workarounds. Ingest data seamlessly from any source using webhooks and watch as Signals filters out the noise, alerting you only on what matters. Manage tasks like coverage requests and on-call notifications effortlessly within Slack. You can even acknowledge alerts right there. But here's the game changer. Signals natively integrates with Fire Hydrant's full incident management suite. So as soon as you're alerted, you can seamlessly kick off and manage your entire incident inside a single platform. Learn more or switch today at firehydrant.com/signals. Again, firehydrant.com/signals.
So today on the show, like we said, we have Andy Glover, who is the CTO at ReadySet, and we will get into some of the details about what he's doing at ReadySet. But this podcast specifically is about his 10 years at Netflix working on the productivity engineering team and what that means and how that interacts with DevOps and platform engineering and all of the things that is not necessarily current Netflix, but from his experience of going through a big transition of DVDs to streaming services. Welcome to the show, Andy.
Hey, thanks for having me.
How's CTO life?
Oh, CTO life is great. It's, I'm at a small startup. And so having, again, spent a long time at Netflix, a big giant, enterprise basically with huge scale. And now I've, jumped headfirst back into a small startup trying to figure out product market fit with a super interesting technology. So
how do you like the contrast between like startup and like big enterprise? Like,
well, it's very different. When you're at a big enterprise, it's like everything's kind of like done, so to speak. They figured out most problems and it's just more on like execution. And then when you go to a small startup, you have to figure out both, right? It's like you got to figure out what the problem is, how we're going to solve it. And then you got to figure out how to execute. And it's not even just tech, but it's like people and the processes around that as well. So it does make you appreciate when you come from like a Netflix or a Disney or whatever it is, the hard work that the initial, we'll say, founders, who created those companies and created a culture and scaled it to, in the case of Netflix and Disney, billions and billions of dollars and, thousands of people. It gives you a deep appreciation for how hard that is.
Yeah, because they've made those processes so you can focus on the tech, But then when you go to a startup, you've got to do all those processes. Well, and then that kind of goes back to platform engineering, and what your team did is letting, engineers focus on doing just the writing of code while you worked on the infrastructure. So maybe you could explain what a platform engineer is and what the team did.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's fascinating, by the way, is that like platform engineering is becoming kind of like a buzz phrase in our industry. And at Netflix, platform engineering at this point has probably been around, and it predates me. So we'll say 13 plus years. And the whole idea of platform engineering at a Netflix, or I would imagine any company, it's a leverage play. And so when you think about, again, trying to get a product from, 0 to 60 or, like idea to customers' hands, your most expensive resource is people. Whether we like it or not, developers, I think we like it, are very expensive. And as a business, you're like, hey, we want to get this thing, this feature, whatever it is, in front of people as quickly as possible and obviously as reliably as possible as well. And so when you look at a platform team, the whole idea there is to ultimately make, we'll say, development teams more productive. Again, it's that leverage play. Like, what can platform engineers do to enable the feature engineer to like work on their feature and not have to worry about like, quote unquote, we'll say the platform, or in this case, infrastructure, but I'm putting that as quotes as well, because like infrastructure is very large. It's not just machines, but it's everything around the machines. And so at Netflix, platform largely is 3 domains. It's like development experience, compute, basically where all this stuff runs, and then storage. And that's platform. And I imagine that's pretty much platform at any large or any company. You don't have to be a large company to have a platform. But certainly I imagine, big enterprises like Disney, Netflix, and the like have platform teams. And again, the whole purpose as a platform engineer is you are enabling other engineers to be more productive. And we can talk about what productive means, but that's the goal.
Were you guys like the beginning of the concept of the platform teams?
Yeah, I think Netflix probably was leading the charge there. I mean, I'd never really... It's funny because when you're there, you don't realize it.
Well, I mean, at Netflix, were you guys the first platform teams at Netflix?
Were we the first platform teams at Netflix? Yes.
So like when you start, right? Because like you said, people are expensive and you're getting this whole team that you're creating to do this. What metrics did you use to kind of quantify like you were doing a good job and this was valuable?
Great question. I think, and that story definitely has evolved, and full disclosure, is still, I imagine, still evolving at Netflix. So when I got to Netflix, the metric for leverage at the end of the day was very much like asking other teams, are you getting value out of these platform teams? And there was no like singular metric that you could measure other than like, hey, Justin, your team does this feature thing on iOS. Do you feel platform's giving you some sort of leverage? And usually the answer was yes. If it was a no, then it was like, well, how can then we like do better? Autumn, are you getting what you think you need out of platform? And so it was a constant conversation across the company to ensure that we were providing value. And I think the metrics were even finer grained at a team level. So like I ran delivery engineering. So ultimately I was charged with enabling people to move fast with reliability. And so my metrics would be like, Autumn, are you using my products? And if you weren't, then it's like, why aren't you? And what can I do to enable you to use my products? Today, or I'll say when I was leaving, there was a much more rigorous process put into place to say, could we actually measure, quote unquote, productivity or spend? So how much, from a productivity standpoint, what's the lead time for developers when they come to Netflix? When are they actually quote unquote productive? And we'll say, pushing to production. So how many days is that, or hours?
That seems to be the industry standard now of all big enterprises. Like, when can you get people in and when can they start contributing, basically?
Yeah, because back to that, they're expensive.
Yeah, it's a return on investment, right? It's like, hey, we're investing in this person. We have a contract, and their time should be making us money. And Andy, you're mentioning Disney, and I don't know if we actually have mentioned it on the podcast yet, but I used to work on the productivity engineering team at Disney Plus, and so this topic is near and dear to my heart. And so you've talked about platform engineering. How do you differentiate that from productivity engineering?
Well, so at Netflix, productivity engineering was a suborg of platform. So again, back to the notion of, lowercase p platform teams are charged with a leverage play. And then there's a focus of that leverage. And so at Netflix, productivity engineering, when I was there, was very much focused on the developer experience at Netflix. And how could we make developers more productive through the life cycle, the SDLC of your day-to-day interaction, let's say with code. And so we thought of it in 3 domains. There was a focus on the local development experience, where you and I were talking about like Spring Boot and whatnot. And there's other languages in there. And then it was the delivery experience, CI/CD. Like, so how do I take, what I've written locally and get it somewhere reliably? And then there was like, we'll call it like the, production or operational experience. Like, how can I observe it and obviously fix it if something happens? And that's productivity engineering that sits in a larger organization that is then like charged with, well, where's all this stuff run? Where's the, the compute infrastructure, if you will, which is quite large at a, again, a streaming company. And then actually even bigger is data, right? Like, so where's all the data that we're gathering? Where's it rest? And then like, how can we access it and what can we like make sense of it? Or how can we make sense of it?
It's really cool because your time at Netflix not only went from like the DVD to like streaming, but also it was a huge time for infrastructure, right? Like infrastructure has come so far in the last like 5-10 years. There's just so many more, I guess, products in the market for like, hey, come do this, come use Terraform, come use Ansible, come use like all these different like parts of like, and more things are available. People want to automate it in different ways. So how did like the boom of like, I guess, infrastructure tech, maybe, I don't know what you call it, and like the fact that you were transitioning from like DVDs to like streaming, like that's a lot of change and a lot of industry change and growth. Like that's a very exciting time.
It was. I joined Netflix in 2013, and they had already, as an organization, decided, hey, we're going to do this streaming thing. So they had been streaming for a little while. And moreover, the big thing that Netflix, pioneered then, which now is like, it doesn't even seem neat, is they were in a data center and they were like, hey, we're going to the cloud. Back to your point about infrastructure. And so that also coincided with it. We've got this DVD thing and we want to do the streaming thing. And so there was a very deliberate decision to separate the two. Like DVD is going to run on its own, all intents and purposes, in a different room, different infrastructure, different, teams. And then we're going to do this streaming thing. And we're going to do it in the cloud because we want to be able to scale, basically, or, burst out into more capacity.
Which is really smart too, because you can completely turn off the DVD because it's separate eventually. And the fact that they started in the cloud meant that they could, like, you don't have to know all of where you're going to scale because it's easier to scale in the cloud. Also, I think Netflix is so good at teaching when they do these transitions, or they do like what they learn. They're super good at kind of playing it forward and like putting it in a blog or giving talks at like reInvent or like different places. Like they're really good at sharing their experience, which I think is cool.
I agree with you. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to go to Netflix, is there was this brand of like, hey, they're doing really interesting things and sharing it with the world. And I think there was a deliberate decision, that obviously predates me, where leadership said, hey, let's do this. Let's share with the world. One, so that we can pay it forward, like you said. I think the other one was its industry validation. So if Netflix shares like, hey, we did this really cool thing, and you all are like, that's the worst idea we've ever heard. We solved it in this way. It's like, well, maybe Netflix is doing it wrong. It just so happened Netflix was doing a lot of things right because they were early.
It's also great recruitment tools because when, the next engineer reads it and they're like, that is awesome, I want to be a part of it,
That's a really good point about like recruitment and sharing, because I was from the outside following what Netflix was doing for a very long time. With when you initially were going to the cloud, you were making immutable infrastructure, you were making these, VM images, and then you were shipping your application as a VM, and then containers came out. And Netflix didn't share a lot because you had this product as a productivity, as a platform team. You were all in on VMs for a while. You were shipping VMs and packaging those in ways that could be reused and scaled, ASGs. It works great. But then like containers comes around, it's like, actually, we could ship a smaller package and we can make it react a little faster. And it took a little while for Netflix to really come out and start talking about containers and how you were using it with Titus, the container orchestrator that was built that originally was Mesos based. And I think it's now it's Kubernetes based, but like,
yep.
You went through these multiple sales cycles as a platform team? How did those migrations essentially impact what the developers were responsible for, or how much they had to know? Because that shift from on-prem to golden image VM building to container orchestration are very different environments for one platform team to kind of see it through.
So the short answer is it's super, super painful. And I've got like scars all over me. And so if I start weeping during this conversation, like, please edit it out.
When you get like PTSD, you're like, oh, like, I remember that.
Gosh, Justin, why did you go there? So you captured it.
And he's sweating.
So I think this is a lesson learned, for all of us, right? It's not unique to Netflix, but what happens is you build this machine that works really, really well. And so what you painted is like, yeah, Netflix built, I'll say, a machine that enabled rapid, development and I'll say reliable development in AWS with VMs, right? And, in retrospect, everything's great in the rearview mirror. And it was like, yeah, it was kind of painful here and there, but like it was battle hardened and rock solid. And then containers came out. And there was a lot of conversations on, hey, how do we take advantage of containers? And there's kind of two ways of looking at the advantage of containers. There's the developer experience, which I want to definitely, come back to. And then there's the infrastructure, like how do you actually run these things, right? I think it was pretty much near universal within, let's say, Netflix engineering that the developer experience with containers is just superior to what was before, right? And that was, I remember, in my early days at Netflix, firing up, services that I was working on. And it was kind of painful. Like, how do I actually test this thing and run it locally? And the fact is you couldn't always run it locally. So you had to deploy it to the cloud and all that. And back to your point, like baking that like golden image took time. So like, again, everyone talks about moving fast and breaking things. The reality is no one wants to break anything, but everyone definitely wants to move fast. And so it's like, how quickly can I add a feature and then get it in front of somebody? And that was slow compared to kind of where the company is today. And it was that whole VM based thing. So there was definitely a lot of conversations on how basically development teams could leverage containers and then deliver that quote unquote to the infrastructure and then let the infrastructure figure out how to where and how to run those containers. That story is probably, again, I've been out of Netflix for a year, but probably still being told. And it's probably a great podcast that you should do is talk to like where they are. But that was I'll say it's probably still a very challenging evolution because ultimately, if you think about platform teams providing leverage, running a massive infrastructure like Netflix, think about like the billions of devices that are like streaming at any given point across the world. It's super reliable. And it based on, we'll say VM ASGs. And then you want to change that to something else like a container orchestration engine. We'll just say Kubernetes. Titus is Netflix's manifestation. It's definitely come a long way in being battle hardened, but it's just a new way of like, how are we going to run these things at scale? And there was always that tension of like, well, we've got great observability. We've got great reliability. We know how to like when these things break, we know how to spin them up. We can evacuate regions. We can do all these things. And then you introduce kind of a new layer in infrastructure and it's just a lot of new work. And so that migration, Titus was born probably, 2014, 15. And, when I left last year, it's still there. Now, there was a great use case for containers in, we'll say, production that, I'm sure you can read about this on the Netflix blog that was batch processing. So if you think about like the Netflix infrastructure, there's all the infrastructure required for you to watch something in the moment, right? And in fact, the reality is like when you sign into Netflix and you see all the, you are authenticated and then you see like, the list of content, that's all served up with AWS. And then when you hit play, it actually is served up from a point of presence near you, like a POP. And there's so Netflix runs its own CDN, right? And so the compute needed to do that AWS or that, want to come in and sign in and see what's available is one piece. And then there's all the compute needed on the back side of that to say like, hey, Autumn, this is your recommendation. Like based on these things you watch, this is what we're going to show you. That's a batch process. And those teams found immediate value with something like Titus years and years ago. So that's where Titus kind of got its foothold. And now where it is today, like I said, probably a great conversation to have with someone there now. But
well, open invitation to anyone on the Titus team or the Netflix Pop, the CDN team, because that is actually one of the most fascinating things that I've always thought of. Because Disney Plus, we used other people's CDNs. It was just like, hey, we just find all the CDNs all around the world that already exist. And Netflix is one of the really good success hybrid stories where you use on-prem point of presence, where you actually have hardware that you're responsible for. They go out to colos for the things that make sense. That like, hey, guess what? I don't want to pay for egress. And we could just like do peering contracts with the people in these areas and put a box in a colo. And then we can store all our bits there, that whatever's needed in that region, and serve it up. And then all that other like dynamic stuff that might need to scale for live events or big signups for Stranger Things or whatever, like that can be a little more dynamic in a cloud environment where it's like, oh, those do scale up and down. These points of presence, they don't have to scale up and down. We don't have to do dynamic scaling for everything. Let's just do on-prem where on-prem makes sense and use the cloud where the cloud makes sense.
I have so many questions. I'm so excited about this.
Yeah, we should totally talk with the Open Connect. So the CDN team at Netflix is called Open Connect. And those folks, they've done just incredible work. I mean, everyone at Netflix has done incredible work, but they've done some really interesting work from that standpoint.
I love that your experience, like everybody talks about building cool things, but nobody talks about like that growing pains that you go through when you're in the middle of building those cool things and you look back and you're like, it was cool, but like, wow, you know, but also like, so Justin, what was it like while you were building Disney Plus? And then like, what was the relationship kind of wanting to learn from what Netflix did? Versus you guys are building a streaming service. Netflix is kind of like your partner and you're both building this. Like what if, and then also like for you, Andy, like Disney Plus, this new competitor is coming, but you also work with them. Like what was that like for you guys? Both.
I mean, we never met before, which is fun. But also like when I joined at Disney Plus, it was a year before Disney Plus launched. And so we had one goal in mind, was like, it cannot crash on launch day. That was it. Like a lot of the stuff had already been established. They already had a lot of container stuff there. We had a very similar productivity engineering team where we had a deployment team, we had a CI/CD team, and then we had an infrastructure observability team, which was my team. That was the group I was on.
But let's give you credit though. Like it launched during COVID and they had so many more users than it was supposed to. The fact that it didn't crash is like, wow. Like, you know what I mean?
It launched November 6th. It launched just before COVID.
Well, but I mean, like, it was such a rush. You know what I mean?
I did not sleep that night because I was just excited for it, right? Like, it was coming. I was like, this is literally like, I was watching the Slack channel of people like, hey, we're pushing the app live in this store. We're pushing the app live here. Oh, it's going live in this region. It's going live here. And I'm like, I slept for, I think, 3 hours that night. And to this day, the very best thing that I ever did was just before I went to bed, I'm like, I'm going to set a Twitter alert for hashtag Disney is down. Literally, because I'm just like, you know what?
Dang,
like,
Justin, you were preparing for the worst.
No, like seriously, like what's going to happen? And like, I'm like, my alarms aren't going to hit at some point, and I want to know from my customer if this is going to happen because I was responsible for the infrastructure.
So it launched and didn't go down, but the fact of scale, think about the fact that they had Disney like sing-alongs and all these things that they had to add because all of a sudden we're stuck in the house. Okay, like our kids are like Disney Plus got me through like having an apprenticeship during COVID. And can you imagine how much scale that they did not expect for? Like you guys had so many customers. Like
Andy, I don't know about for you, but like one of the, I don't know, dirty secrets, the interesting secrets for me was the fact that like Disney Plus was not dynamically scaling on launch day. Like it was scaling a bit, but like we had scaled up for probably 3 weeks before. Like we're like, this is how much we expect to need. We need to pre-warm load balancers. We need to have scaling groups already ready to go. We are not waiting for someone to hit the API and then we're going to add a node. We're like, no. We're just quadrupling all of our infrastructure a month ahead of time, which a lot of people are like, well, you could only dynamically scale in the cloud. I'm like, to some degree. I was like, but I could have bought hardware for that. Like we could have had that here in a month and racked and stacked and ready to go sort of thing. But like, yeah, like that was one of the interesting things to me was like launching Disney Plus, which went from 0 to 10 million users in 24 hours.
And then after in months, like the amount of people that it got, and think about it, it's not like people were watching for a couple hours after school. People were watching 24/7 trying to get their kids to sit down.
It was a great experience for me to be able to go, especially coming from movies, because movies, once the movie launched, I didn't do anything. I didn't have to touch a thing. Like we literally like would archive all of the stuff. It was like, okay, Frozen 2 is out. There you go. Just go ahead and put that in the archive. We moved to the next thing. Disney Plus was the exact opposite, where it's like, hey, you're launching something. Say, Stranger Things come out, and like now the work starts, right? Like, hey, we're working up to this point, and now we have to do all the other work to make it happen all the time.
Not just that, but you guys soft launched, so you were still pulling things from Netflix. You know what I mean? Like you had to continue to add so much content. Like when you first got it, like what?
And that's like a different like Disney and Netflix, they're so big, like at the enterprise level, like that's a completely different team. Like the most complex step functions infrastructure I've ever seen was the media ingestion pipeline for Disney Plus. And the amount of steps that have, I was just like, because we used a lot of Lambda, a lot of step functions, I mean, like when I saw that, I was just like, whoa, what are we doing? Like this is.
And could you imagine if like one thing breaks, like, you know, like.
Well, and like the amount of checkpointing and streams you have to say, like, oh, we made it to this step, so now we're going to restart from there once we get a new one, and all this stuff. Like,
what kind of like testing do you do with that much data, like to make sure it's intensive for what it's going to do? You know. Also, something I thought was really interesting, like as like a baby SA, when you start, you have to like do like a mock presentation, right? And like one of the coolest things was that because there's only so much you can talk about, and Netflix and Disney are actually like really cool customers that let you talk about like, you know, the compute. Like I said, they're really good at sharing, especially Netflix. And I remember getting to put like Baby Yoda on a slide because Disney Plus used DynamoDB for bookmarks. Like it's so cool the way that Netflix and Disney Plus use data to then suggest things to their customers. Like what was that like? Because I'm guessing when you were there during the first part of streaming and everything, like you started taking in data that you probably weren't taking in before to learn more about customers and to suggest stuff. So like, what did you have to do for infrastructure for like trying to take in that new data and use it, you know, for like the platform things?
Well, yeah, therein lies all the scale like challenges. So Netflix in the end ended up using Cassandra. I think there were early
Can
experience.
we just talk about that for like 4 seconds? Like I used to be on the Keyspace teams, and Netflix literally hire some of the best Cassandra like database people, and that is hard to find. Like that is a skill. Like scaling Cassandra is no easy task. Like it is a whole thing. Those nodes are picky.
Yeah, no, again, that's part of that. You know, when I talk about platform and leverage, there was a platform team, you know, focused on Cassandra. And scaling it, you know, with the rings and I think there were early experiments that predate me. I think, you know, that the teams were looking at like SimpleDB, and there were some products that leveraged SimpleDB when I got there. But in the end, it was a conscious choice. You know, we're going to store our streaming data in Cassandra. Today, Netflix uses probably every, you know, database under the sun to do something, you know.
But it's still amazing because when you go to a Cassandra, like presentations and different talks and like different like conferences, some of the best engineering talks are from Netflix because they have some of the best, and they've used it so long and they put so much, like Cassandra is a highly available, like super big scale data, like database, you know, like you're not going to use that unless you are taking in like tons of data, and it needs to be everywhere, you know. And it's just so impressive, like how Justin was saying about how like they pick like what they want to run on-prem, what they want to run in the cloud. Like they've made such good choice, like Netflix, even with like, you know, what you guys went through with like containers and everything, they've made such good choices of like hiring the best people for a lot of things and finding the right tech for things. The fact that they are so good at picking what to run in the cloud, run on-prem, like.
And I mean, what we were just saying about that though, like that's a hard-earned best choice, right? Like you had to make the mistakes first.
I was going to say, yeah, because, you know, we're here again looking in the rearview mirror being like, man, they made so many good choices. And what you don't know is all the failures that went into making that choice, right?
But to be able to pivot, though, a lot of people will be like, this was a horrible idea, but we're going to keep going, you know, because it's how we've always done it. You know, like that is a thing.
I think that gets to one of the key benefits of a platform team is because your platform is moving while you're trying to keep some consistency for the people that don't need to learn all of those other bits of like, hey, we went from VMs to containers. Hopefully your developer experience isn't completely different. There are going to be changes. We are going to do some things different, but hopefully at least some of the interfaces and some of the things that you know as a developer have not completely shifted out from underneath you, like they might have when you went from on-prem to the cloud.
Sure.
Right. Like the first time you're just like, this is in a different place. I don't know what's going on. Like my box under my desk was the fastest way I could ship anything in an on-prem environment. Cause it's like, hey, I already have a computer. I already have resources. It's already on the network. Here, everyone hit my IP address. And then we're going to add it to DNS. And then we're going to ship my box, right? Like that's the new production thing. And you kind of want that experience for wherever you go. You want to make it that easy to say, I don't care if you're going to Amazon in a VM or a container or a CDN, you should be able to get the same. The box under my desk is the most I need to understand. I can set up my dev experience and then get be productive in writing lines of code, closing tickets, whatever it is of that measurements. And then everything else is someone else's team to make sure that that experience is seen through end to end.
That also relates to the article you're talking about of cognitive load and like focus of like developers, because like every time you have to go figure out the stuff that's underneath what you work on, like you're stopping what you're doing, you're stopping your flow, and then you have to go figure this out and debug it for forever. So as long as you can keep people like working kind of in their zone and like not adding to their cognitive load and like as much context switching, like we all do it, but you know, like the least amount possible, you're so much more productive, you know, so like that adds so much value.
I agree. And I think, you know, as I was thinking through kind of like all the lessons learned that you can learn from a Netflix and a Disney and every other, you know, company out there that's, you know, articulating, hey, we learned this lesson. I think a big part of that is like humility and empathy. And that's, you know, very much going back to our conversation about, you know, when you go to a small company and you realize, wow, at this big company, they established like this culture. And one of the things that I appreciate having learned, you know, having spent time at Netflix was the values of one, humility, and being able to talk through like, hey, we messed this up. So that manifests itself in like blameless postmortems and like all these lessons learned and like, hey, this thing broke really badly and ultimately affected, you know, X, Y, and Z, whether that be you as a member trying to stream or you as a developer trying to do this thing in production or whatever. And importantly, trying to figure out like, what did we learn from that? How can we make it better?
I think engineering would be such a better culture if we had more empathy, because you have to break things to learn. But if we don't share knowledge and have empathy, like everybody's too scared to break things or to ask questions. And I think we'd scale so much faster.
Well, and then, you know, back to like the definition of a platform team is ultimately like it's a leverage play, right? And how can I, you know, provide, you know, you and Justin leverage? I have to understand like what you are trying to get done. I have to have empathy for like your job. And each of you are probably doing something different, right? Like let's, you know, imagine, you know, Autumn, you're a data team trying to basically, you know, scale or, you know, get answers from data. And then Justin, you're an edge team trying to make sure, you know, whatever, you know, these devices work in this region. And they're two separate problems. And I got to figure out like, well, what is the leverage like play that I can help both of you? And it's probably a bad use case, but if I ignore you, Autumn, and I help Justin, then back to our kind of metrics discussion, when I come to you and be like, hey, is platform providing value to you? You're going to be like, no, I had to do all this myself. And I was hoping you all could do some of that for me because I have limited capacity. You know, again, people are expensive and we're trying to get this stuff done for the business. And ideally, the commonality is done by you as a platform team. And so that's really important, is having that like empathetic relationship so that you can, you know, again, show success when it comes to metrics and investing in something like a platform.
I don't know how this was for you, but one of the best tips that I give that I learned from Disney Plus was building a platform. Like the best thing we ever did was we said no to some teams. We said, actually, our platform's not going to be for you. For the people that had data, they're like, I need stateful workloads. And I was like, I cannot give you stateful workloads right now. If you need that, you have to go do it yourself. You have to go flex that muscle and learn how to do it. I can only solve the problem for the other people that would either want to re-architect into what I can give them, or the people that already fit this. And so I think when they started that platform, which was, you know, stateless containers on top of ECS, it was probably like 40 to 50% of like applications fit that. Like, cool, we're going to give half of the architecture is going to fit here. And then people started re-architecting and we're like, oh, we're getting 20, 30% on top of that because people are like, oh, you know what, this isn't so hard. I'll put that in a database and we'll just run here as a stateless workload. But that other like 20 to 30% on top of it, we're like, no, actually, I can't just do that. I need a file system and I need it to be persistent and all of those things. I'm sorry. Like I cannot solve that problem for you. And I see platform teams think that they have to be 100%. And they have to solve everyone's problem. And they don't understand that just adds complexity for the other people. The, you know, the 30% end tail of people you might want on the platform are going to make it so much more complicated for the other 70% that are already on the platform. And being able to say no to people is like a huge benefit of just like, actually, no, I'm not going to do that for you.
Couldn't agree more. Easier said than done.
Yes. You need political capital for that.
And so a lesson learned, and I think, you know, there's three things that came to mind as you were talking about that is certainly me as a leader. I have made those mistakes in my past at Netflix is not saying no, right? And it's usually like, no, not now. It's not no, not never.
Yeah.
And I think in general, because platform teams are, you know, a leverage play, and again, we'll say with lack of like hardcore metrics, it was very much like a, you know, we'll say kind of a feeling like, hey, again, Autumn, am I helping you? And if you're like, no, then it's like, well, I got to figure out how to help you. And so I'm almost incentivized to say yes, even when I should be saying no. So there's that.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. So there's a balance there. But I couldn't agree more, Justin, in terms of, I think to be an effective platform team, you have to like basically say no and figure out like what is the leverage play that, and there's other metrics in there. Like let's imagine, your org, Justin, in this imaginary world is bigger or like generates more revenue, whatever it is. There's metrics there that help inform like, okay, platform's going to provide leverage to Justin's team. Autumn, we can't do it. And then empowering, let's say that those teams to be like, you can build your own platform team if you need to. And like, we'll figure out a path in the future to, maybe reintegrate that to a commonality play. The other thing that came to mind, we were talking about this earlier, lesson learned is evolution is hard, especially in the infrastructure space. You don't know what you don't know in the future, right? And so like, can you build today, with the future in mind? And sometimes like you can, but a lot of times you're just trying to get stuff done, right? And so, with Disney, like I'm pretty sure you all like came out of the box, you were using Kubernetes, right? Like you were.
It was all ECS.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So, but you were born with containers, right?
Yeah.
Netflix, when it was born, was not using containers. So there was this evolutionary challenge of like, how do we, as a company, do we leverage this new tech that, appears to, provide, let's say, a productivity play? And so one of the challenges we learned, through evolution was the idea of like abstractions and opinions, back to no. So abstractions, when Netflix went to the cloud, for lack of a better way of putting it, a lot of bells and whistles and knobs and dials were exposed up the stack, right? And that made sense because people were just figuring this stuff out. Like, how do we leverage the cloud? So like here, app team, basically here's a dial to do this thing or whatever. Makes sense in the moment. It enabled Netflix to move fast, made it hard as Netflix evolved. Like, how do we change things underneath without affecting, the teams on the top? And that's really hard.
Well, taking away a dial is really difficult. Like, hey, guess what? Like, I'm going to set that for you now.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I need that dial.
Even if they weren't using it, even if they never changed the default, once the setting's gone, you're just like, wait a minute, what happened to my dial? I want that.
I also think that when you allow an engineering team to focus on kind of figuring out the first solution, they can kind of do a better job. And like, it's when like management kind of like shields you from doing a million things at once, you can focus, get that out, and then go to the next project or whatever. But like you said, you want your customers to feel like been heard, so it's cool to hear somebody who is in leadership and not like a huge company for so long talk about empathy and like talk about like the struggle it is to keep like all the people happy. You know what I mean? Because I feel like we don't have enough empathy in tech. And like a lot of it is like, you just have to be like a hardcore developer times 100 and like sleep at the office. You know what I mean? And nobody talks about that empathy. And I think we would have like such a better culture if more people, like, it makes me happy that you're a CTO now at a startup because you're like, the fact that you talked about that empathy and like also the struggles of like wanting to do right by like everybody, like we need more leaders and that kind of coming from that place, and like talking about that, because that is rarely the answer when you ask people about like what you need in engineering. You know what I mean? Like people are like, so I just think that's really cool.
Well, there's an old saying, right? Like tech's easy, people are hard. And so I think to be an effective leader, you have to understand, the humans and figure out kind of like, hey, what am I trying to build for you? And why do you need this? Or what problems do you have and how can I help you? And why do you have those problems? There's one thing I wanted to come back to when we were talking about, Disney Plus and COVID, all the lessons learned. Netflix had this idea, or I'll say the Super Bowl was Netflix's, or I should say, excuse me, New Year's Day was Netflix's version of the Super Bowl. The idea being is that like all the humans would basically watch a lot of Netflix on New Year's Day. And so that was the day that everyone wanted to make sure like the thing works, right? Back to your point, Justin, like, hey, there's an alert, make sure Netflix is working on New Year's Day. The second, I think, best day was like Christmas Day because everyone would get like a new TV with like Netflix on it, right?
That's what I was wondering, like why New Year's? Because you think like also Christmas, people watch so many Christmas movies and all the kids are home. So like why New Year's, I wonder?
That's a good question because New Year's Day, I usually was doing something outside. But anyways, point being is that we always had these records like, hey, in 2018, we set a new record, our Super Bowl day was, blah. And obviously that informed how we built our infrastructure and how we scaled it. Long story short, COVID hits. The entire world is in lockdown and everyone's basically watching Disney Plus and Netflix. Specifically on Netflix, I think everyone was watching the Tiger one, right? I forget the name of that show, but
yeah.
and essentially Netflix had its Super Bowl like every day, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger in terms of the numbers of people watching Netflix simultaneously. And the infrastructure just scaled. Like it worked. And so it's a testament to like everything we've talked about, all the lessons learned, all the amazing people that were like working hard and, you know, were there in the moment, or who had like left previously, but like helped build this machine. It worked. Netflix scaled and was able to stream pretty much flawlessly throughout, you know, lockdown, and hopefully brought some amount of joy.
Oh, you brought me so much joy. Like, not just me, but the fact that my kids could sit down for 5 seconds.
Yeah. And it was, you know, in the moment, it was really scary. Like you were saying, Justin, you know, everyone's like on their, just like worried that the thing's going to fall over and like, how are we going to fix this? Because we're all like remote. And it worked. And I think it speaks again to the notion, if you invest in a leverage play in a platform team and you staff it with amazing engineers who are humble and empathetic and many other, you know, important facets we could dig into some other time, you get that payoff. And that was it for Netflix. Was, you know, the lockdown, the globe basically watched, you know, the content. And since leaving, I don't know if, you know, Netflix has hit, you know, new records in terms of streaming, but I doubt they are as big as they were at that moment. Just like, and I'm sure it's similar for Disney Plus.
What you described to me sounds a lot just like momentum. If I have a car and like I push it down a hill, like it's just going to keep going without me adding more efforts. But if one of the wheels is like not aligned or loose, like it's going to start veering one way or another. It's just like, oh, that's not the direction we want to go. And aligning yourself, your infrastructure and your applications to be able to be reliable enough to kind of coast for a while is a huge thing. Like it's a big investment up front. You have to make sure things are ready to go. But a lot of people ask me like, why is it like Twitter was supposed to fail, right? Like they let go all these people, all this infrastructure stuff. And I'm like, they had such a good infrastructure team to scale up and down over time that like there's so much momentum there. If you don't change things, you can coast for a very, very long time.
And I don't think they get enough credit. Like the people that built it to not fall over do not get enough credit. You know what I mean?
I knew a lot of people on the Twitter team. I'm like, they were great engineers and they were doing stuff in the right ways from everything that I could see on the outside. But yeah, like it takes a lot of investment up front to like, hey, how do we just set this up? And if we are not constantly making new changes and replatforming and doing this other stuff, like you can stay on that for a long time, which is also the hard part of being able to say the platform needs to change now.
Yep.
Like there is going to be a big shift, right? Like we have to move in a different direction.
Well, and it goes back to, I'll say one thing about humility, back to is, you know, 99.99% of the time platform just works. And if you are a customer of the quote unquote platform, you don't think about it, right? If you've done your job well as a platform team, app teams don't know, right? They only know when it breaks. And that's that, you know, 0.01 time. And that's when they're really upset because they're like, hey, this thing isn't working and I can't like do my job. And it is a rightful kind of like surprise or whatever, anger or frustration. But you have to have that humility to not be like, hey, Justin, it was working, you know, for the last 25 hours and you didn't ever say thank you. And then you just got to jump on and be like, Justin's blocked. Let's fix his problem. And the other thing I'll say that, again, testament to investment in platforms is, you know, you build these massive systems. And one thing Netflix, and we were talking about this earlier, Autumn, that Netflix invested heavily in was I'll put it in quotes, is the idea of chaos, right? It's like things break in a distributed system. That is a certainty, right? Like, in fact, there was almost a mantra of like, let's not try to, get every edge case tested because we know it's going to break in some weird way. And so Netflix proactively led the charge. And I know Amazon and other companies were doing this as well, of like, let's just break it on purpose and get really good at recovering.
Chaos engineering at Netflix was like, I remember like being in college and just reading all the articles, and like I think my favorite is Postmortems, Netflix's like blog about all the cool stuff they do, and then just reading about how they were like, we're gonna go in and just do crazy stuff and like absolutely like just wreck everything, and then we're gonna learn from it. Like I love that. It's like the puzzle, like it's seeing like the real puzzle and like experimenting of like engineering, like the real computer science part, you know, because like it is a science. You break it all, you experiment, and then you fix it. Like it's so cool.
Yeah. And even to make that happen, right, there's obviously like a cultural component to make it safe to like, let's go break stuff and hopefully not affect, obviously Autumn and Justin as members of Netflix.
People always say like, oh, you have to break stuff first. And I'm like, you have to give people a safe environment to learn and break stuff. Like, you can't just say break stuff, but we're going to look at you like you're crazy if you break stuff or don't know how to do it. You know what I mean? Like, if you want that kind of innovation, you have to create that culture and that environment.
And one other thing that I think some people forget. So there's the cultural aspect of making it safe to break things. And then there's the technical aspect of having like a great observability platform. So you actually know that, what broke and how it broke. And so I think there's like this, I talked to some companies that are like, yeah, we want to do chaos engineering. And then I was like, well, let's talk about observability. Like, how are you using whatever Datadog or whatever it is? And it's like, we don't really have a great story there. It's like, well, you definitely don't want to be breaking things, like fix that first.
I made a tweet about that, I think a week ago. It was somebody from a company and he was talking about like, I think he had like worked somewhere for 10 or 15 years and he was talking about one of the most important things he learned was observability. And I think that it's two planes. Like, so you want to be observable with like metrics with your system, but also you should have some sort of like a beat on your customers and how they're giving you like feedback to what they like. You know what I mean? But observability is like one of the most underrated parts of tech, because how do you build good things if you don't have metrics to know if they're working properly and if your customers are happy? Like, that's not just something product and other people should be like concerned about. Like, your engineers need to know that. Because how are they going to build, like, how are they going to make good decisions? How do they make good designs? Like, you know what I mean?
I set up Twitter notifications for hashtags. What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Back the alerting. Right?
That's what I'm saying. But it's underrated, though. That's something that we do in our personal time. That's never part of the, like, job description, and it should be. You know what I mean? Like, when you have more of an insight to customers and the business side, you can be a better engineer and you can add more value. And I, like, love that you said that because it is so underrated.
And I think that's a really difficult thing with something like productivity engineering or platform engineering, when the actual metric you're getting from someone, like, you can get the, are you using my platform, right? But like at the end of the day, it's kind of just like a vibes metric, right? Like, you have to go talk to the human. You have to go ask the person, hey, is this valuable? Whatever your definition of valuable is, you need to tell me yes or no.
But just like Andy said, that's like a Yelp review, right? Like, do people make Yelp reviews when they're happy? No, they make them when they're mad. So like, that's such a hard, like, I feel like I almost have so much like empathy for the pressure that you must have been on, because like, can you imagine? They're only calling you when they're upset. Like, so like, it could be great, but it's like, people are just like, oh, it's another day, like, so.
Yeah, I know at one point there, the team was leveraging like NPS, Net Promoter Score. So it's like, hey, Autumn, would you recommend platforms tools to your friends? Is kind of maybe another way of.
And nobody pays attention to those surveys until you have the bad day where you're like, I hate this, and you're like, no, never.
And so one other lesson learned, for what it's worth, going back to empathy, is, again, having the humility to sit there and listen to you, let's say, Autumn, when you're angry, writing the Yelp review of like how horrible it is, but then being able to have kind of, again, the realization of like, she cares enough to tell us, right? Because the worst thing is, I don't like your product, and so I'm just not going to use it, and I'm never going to tell you. And so having kind of like the presence of mind to be like, okay, this person doesn't like what I've built for them, but at least they care enough to tell me. And so let me learn, and then I can figure out how to prioritize that. Having gone through that process many times, both at Netflix and before, I do find that that's kind of another skill of, sometimes people just don't want to hear from the angry customer. And it's like, they took the time to tell you. That's a blessing. You should thank them.
I love that you said that, because we used to always get like, well, your connection part is broken, or we hate this here, or we don't have this feature, so we're never using your service again, right? But like, to me, like, okay, yes, you had a bad day, but they also told you, like, if you get so many, like, I would go and I would kind of like use the RSS feed to see, like, and I would take the data from like Stack Overflow and like different places, and I would be like, okay, but if 8 people are saying the same thing, and then every month it goes up, and you've got like 45 people saying, I would use your service if you had this one thing, like, your product needs to know about that. Like, you guys need to start having that discussion of like, do we need to add this feature? Like, you know what I mean? Like, we would work with teams that used our product more than we did. They know, you know what I mean? Like, they are great, like, feedback, take it, because you can make such a better product if you listen to them.
One of the best investments I ever made in that feedback loop was literally just buying some donuts and setting them out in our area, and then just inviting our customer. Like, I just emailed the customer teams. I'm like, hey, by the way, there's free donuts over here. No, there's no meeting. There's no requirement. No, nothing. Like, this is just.
Okay. It makes me sad. I take donuts into the office all the time, and everyone's always on a diet. So I just sit there and eat them by myself. And I'm just like, why?
I do think that, post COVID with a lot more remote work and a lot more people that might be like maybe gain some COVID weight like I did. Like there's a lot of that where it's just like actually like people have changed their mindsets on some of those things. So maybe it's we need to buy some lunch or something like that.
Swag, stickers.
Yeah, whatever it is. Like
no,
find
guys,
something that
let's go back to donuts. What's no?
Fine, gluten-free, sugar-free, vegan donuts.
This is how we know Justin doesn't drink coffee. He was ready to give up donuts. Like you have questionable life choices. Like we're friends, but
to the, I mean, like appealing to the human side of it was the best way to get any sort of feedback. No metrics I was collecting could tell me the things I was missing, and being able to go talk to my customer in person and just say like, hey, like, how's your project going? Like, don't even talk about mine. Like, just like, how's your sprint going? Like what tickets are you punting on? All that sort of stuff like is so valuable to make the human connection between people to get the actual, feedback that you could never measure and you could never find it on a dashboard. But then you can say like, actually, I get what they were saying because I can connect that to something else that someone else told me, and maybe they're related. And that in and of itself allows you to know exactly, or at least get a vibe on like how the platform's doing, if you need to change directions, if there's some other problem that's underlying it that's like, actually people hate our tools, and we should just throw it all away.
I just want to point out that what you're both saying is that engineers need people skills.
They do.
No, but it's so underrated. Nobody pays attention to soft skills. Like that is so important to work with other humans.
Again, coming full circle, this theme of full circle in our conversation. So I'm originally from the East Coast. I'm talking to you from the West Coast. Netflix made me move to the Bay Area because Netflix at that time had a policy. All engineering is co-located. We were in a few buildings, and back to kind of relationships and to your point about like, hey, donuts. A lot of people, would ask like, well, how do you gather priorities and meet your customers? And it's like, well, it's all about relationships, and I used to brag at one point, I did feel this. I knew every engineer at Netflix, let's say in 2014, 15, because we were all on the same campus. We had lunch together. We could get coffee. And I would go to you, Justin, and be like, hey, I'm building this thing. Like, can you help me? Like, or can I help you? And can you help me make it better? And COVID obviously dispersed everyone. We had to go remote, and we lived on those kind of relationships because I had met you, Autumn, in person. We had coffee together. We had that kind of like trust. And then obviously we did a bunch of hiring. Every company did that. And so I think one of the biggest, issues that I think we're all struggling with is how do we move fast with, empathy, obviously getting stuff done from a tech standpoint, and humility in this remote, hybrid world. It's hard. I don't have a good answer. Some companies are just like, hey, return to office. You got to come to the office, whatever, X days a week.
We're actually doing a talk on that, me and a couple of my friends that also work at the same company, because we're a nonprofit and we have a board, but our board is dispersed like all over the world because they're military spouses. So there's people in Guam, there's people in Japan, there's people in California, just everywhere. And we're all in different time zones, right? So like we planned full hackathons across the country in different time zones. We've run a whole nonprofit, and scaled it from no money to giving out scholarships, and at this point, we're partners with the DoD, with the military spouse employment programs, and we're the only nonprofit in there. And you have to be able to ask questions, ask about people's lives. Hey, I saw that you had a kid or a dog, or me and Justin will talk about Disney, or and me and Justin have never met in real life.
Well, this is real life. It's just
no, this is actually not.
You know what I mean? Not in person. We've never been in the same, Skill will be the first time that we ever meet each other, in real life, physically. So it's I think people need to make the effort, and there needs to be more, to get to know people as humans, you know what I mean? And to treat people as we're humans and we're all going through our own things, and, and to actually reach out. But I think sometimes so much is put on technical skills, but you need to be a human that can relate and talk to each other, because we're trying to solve problems, and engineering is a team sport.
Yeah.
You need each other to do things. So I think that would really help get people forward.
At the end of the day, I think, human beings, I think we all value a sense of belonging, whether it be in a group or with another human, and that's to your point about chit-chatting about Disney or the stuff in Justin's wall or whatever, and what I certainly found and have found with remote is it's very, tactical. It's hey, I got 30 minutes to, talk about business. Let's say Autumn.
It's all transactions.
Yeah. Transactions. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
And it's And you got to take a moment, it was like, how's it going? What's going on in life? Like, what did you do this weekend? And
I make like a point to do that just because like I want to know the people I work with. You know what I mean? Like, honestly, like they're so smart. They're some of the smartest people I've ever met. I'm like, let's be friends. Like, like I want to know all the things. Like, do you have like, it's so funny. Like one of my coworkers has like the cutest dog ever. He's like so much fun. I'm just like, engineers just generally, like we're all like, they think that we all just sit in like a corner in the dark and don't talk to people. So you have to get over that like initial, like, you have to like break down people's like walls and be like, hey, I want to get to know you, and like just kind of ask them about their lives and their weekends and like their families. And it's like amazing.
We had a bot at Disney Plus. I think it was called Donut, which would introduce you. Like anyway, it was an opt-in program, and anyone can opt into it. Anyone that was opted in would get randomly matched with someone else in the program, and it was a great because.
So what you're saying is donuts are amazing.
Yeah, I didn't always give up donuts because I had that still, and so, but yeah, no, like it was a 30-minute, like, hey, you just threw it on your calendar, and it's like you don't know who this person is. They don't work on your team. They don't work with you. Like it's just, hey, here's 30 minutes to not. It's a meeting for no work content, and
that's my favorite part of AWS during COVID. I don't know if it's the same feel now, but like you could literally, like I remember being in one of the first things that you do, like when the 2-day like classes or whatever, and they were like directors, and you could reach out to all of these people that were directors, that were engineers, that were project managers, and they're like, you can grab time on my like calendar. And I took them up on that offer. I was like, I want to know how you got here. Like, I want to know about you. Like, and it was so cool. You could talk to some of the most amazing, brilliant people and learn about them. And it's like so cool. Like they're real people, like they're people, but they're like amazing and so smart, like it was so cool.
When I started at Disney, animation and Disney streaming and Amazon, I asked my manager, who are 3 people that I should meet? Because every time my manager had been there longer, right? And then I'd go meet those 3 people. Like, who are 3 people that I don't work with that I should meet? And then when I talked to those 3 people, I asked them, who are 3 people you think I should go meet? And I would just expand so quickly of just like meeting people that were recommended within, like, and then just say, hey, I have no agenda here. I just want to know what you do, what you're working on. And that, I think, especially at Disney Plus, grew like that platform ability of like, I understand a little more of the business now and like who relies on who. And when I fail, how many people downstream it might affect for a platform team is super important. And that was like
also, there's always a bunch of random Slack channels that you have to join. Like I loved yelling, even though it sucks without you now. How dare you leave us?
That last point you made, Justin, is one more thing I'll add to kind of platform engineering in general, is that if you're in a platform team, you are in essence in the trenches, right? And the people you're supporting are working directly on the product, right? So in the case of Netflix, the teams that my teams were supporting, ultimately, when they got to go home, they could point, if they had a child, hey, look, Susie, you're watching Netflix. Like I made that button right there, blink for you. And there's a certain sense of pride that those end team, the end user teams get. And a platform team sometimes doesn't get that, right? Because it's like, but my whole thing was like, when my kids asked me like, well, what do you do at Netflix, Dad? And I was like, I make sure it works. So like when you watch it, it works, right?
And you also get blamed when it's down.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, Dad, it's in. I'm like, no, that it's buffering. That's Comcast.
Like, did your kids ever like bust into your office and they're like, Dad, you broke it?
No, mostly it was like, hey, Dad, could you get this content on Netflix? It was, it was like, I don't do that. Yeah. And eventually I just started going along with it. Like, sure. Yeah. I'll talk to, I'll talk to so-and-so and we'll see if we can get, whatever.
All right. I'll go talk to Bluey. We'll get it on there.
I'm so jelly. Do you know how hard it is to tell your kids that working in Java is cool? Like, I'm just like, Java's built with Minecraft. Like, I don't know. Minecraft's built with Java. Like, I don't even, like, you had like the coolest kid street cred job. Like,
well, and so the important thing as, a platform team leadership and everything else I've said is also connecting the dots back to, the product, right? And being able to draw that line in terms of like, basically how I said it is we're a leverage play. You enable those teams. When we're down, Netflix is down or Disney's down or whatever, JP Morgan Chase, whatever company you're at, and making that kind of like the mission, right? And the vision of like, yes, you're in the trenches. You're not necessarily working on the end code or the end features for, our user base, but without you, they would not get it, right? And I think that's important for leadership to kind of remind and again, continually draw that, that dotted line of like, what you're doing is vitally important. And without you, the company wouldn't be as successful as it is today.
I think that's a great place to end it. So, Andy, thank you so much. We have been talking for quite a while now, and this has been a great conversation. I know we could talk for another hour about all sorts of different things. But if someone wants to reach out to you or find you online, what's the best place to do that?
So I am on X, formerly known as Twitter, AGLOVER, so A Glover. And I have increasingly found that LinkedIn is becoming somewhat of a new kind of Twitter.
I get way more engagement on LinkedIn now. It's so weird.
I do blog. It's called thediscoblog.com. I've had that for many, many years, and I reincarnated it recently. So yeah, find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or my blog.
Thank you so much, Andy, for being on the show. And we are going to have him back in the future to talk about other things that he's working on. Ready Set sounds really interesting. And he actually has other people that he wants to introduce us to at Netflix that are either currently there or were there. So it's great that Andy was able to come on. And I'm looking forward to more conversations in this space. And just today's episode opened up so many other doors of things that I want to explore.
Totally. For
the end of the show today, we have the segment called WTA.
What the acronym? What the acronyms?
What the acronym? Of course.
I love that you came up with that. It
is obvious, right? It's what the acronym. So as we've been continuing making outros that are not consistent and it's different every show.
You mean variety, it's perspective, variety, Justin.
At some point I'm going to lose ideas and we're just going to go recycle them again. But at least we have, 5 or 6 of them ready to go.
Don't lie with us. We'll find another tangent to go off on.
If there was video in this podcast, we could do GIFs. We could do so many other things. But because it's audio only, we want to focus on the audio. We have some limitations. But anyway, we wanted to explain just some acronyms and what they mean and maybe even where they came from, because acronyms are kind of a core part of tech, and sometimes they're very gatekeepy. And sometimes there's also obvious, oh, I use that acronym all the time and I did not realize that's what it was. And so we wanted to share some. And I'm going to start with actually things that are not technically acronyms, but are numeronyms, where it's a number and a shortened word and it has numbers in it. So the one that I use a lot is K8S. K with the number 8 and S is a shortening of the word Kubernetes.
But why?
Because between the K and the S, there are 8 letters. And that's it. And it starts with the first letter, how many letters in between, and then the last letter.
I always felt so left out. Is there a container secret here?
Nope, it is not. Some people pronounce it Kates, as in Kates, like a name or something, or Kate or something like that. But it is just it's a numeronym that shortens Kubernetes because sometimes people don't want to spell it.
I love that you made all of your acronyms this and you went off on another Justin tangent, and it's great.
A lot of them are in front-end development more and design, because observability is one of them, which we O11Y for there's 11 letters inside of observability between the O and the Y. Internationalization, I18N, because that would be a hard one to spell.
Are they variable names, or are they actually people refer to them with these?
Usually you'll see them in documentation about how to do something, or it's hey, we just don't want to spell, we need to internationalize this all the time. Or accessibility, A11Y, where it's hey, this needs to be accessible. I was it needs to be I just need to add the accessibility or whatever. You just put A11Y and people are oh, okay, we need some accessibility in there. And then the last one that I had was Y2K, which obviously doesn't mean that there's 2 characters between a Y and a K, but it's a millennial tech problem. This was if you're old enough to exist on the internet and be around. It was Y2000.
Are you calling us old? I feel like you're calling us old.
I'm calling myself old because I remember it. I did not work in tech at the time. I was still in high school when Y2K happened. So I did not even have a computer, and I saw it on the news.
I feel better because you're older than me, so I'm just going to assume you're going to be the old one, and I'll just pretend I'm not. Okay, so mine are very database featured, and you know how much I love data, so I'm super excited about this. So ACIT, they're usually ACIT transactions, which is autonomously consistency, isolation, and durability. So if you're a website or any kind of transactions or doing any kind of sales transactions, you don't want your card to be charged twice, right? So like if you refresh or something doesn't load, you wouldn't want to have multiple transactions. So it's basically like a check to making sure the transaction went through and it's not happening multiple times.
You want something to happen only once, right?
Exactly.
So every time I like pull out Apple Pay and tap to pay, I'm going to say acid.
Yes.
Because like I don't want to get double charged, right? So I just have to like.
It's really important because for one, people would stop using their cards to pay online, right? You have to have that trust that people are going to have accurate transactions, and then you also don't want to end up giving away your product without being paid for it, right? So.
But this is more than just card payments, right? Like, I mean, you need other things to be ACID compliant or.
Yeah. Also just making sure that you're getting data. It's a whole compliancy, but that's just to me like the easiest way to explain if you've never seen ACID before, I guess. Or, if it's a new concept, I guess. I like to find real world like relations for things because like I hate when people do that like gatekeeping stuff where they explain stuff at like a really high level, but they don't make it digestible for someone who's never heard it before.
Right. An actual use case.
Yes. Like use cases or like some sort of physical relation to something because I like it when it's related to something that everybody can understand.
I feel like the word acid, like I wish it was more relatable. Like we had fuzzing on the last show and that one has like a very.
I'm really sad that didn't make it into like Ralph, and I'm just going to be sad about it every time I watch Ralph from now on.
But at least that one, like I have a visualization of like what fuzzing is. It's just like, oh, it's like a fuzzy amount of data or something. Like acid, I feel like should be, I don't know. It seems like it would hurt.
Once you know what it does though, and you start seeing it, like it kind of is nice that like crud, like at first I was like crud, but like it makes sense because it has all the different like
the verbs.
Not verbs, but I was thinking like not events, but different things that you would do with the database, right? So CRUD is create, read, update, and delete. Those are all the functions that you want to use with a database, but they're like CRUD operations, right? So like I think it's cool that these are like useful, I guess, because sometimes you have like abbreviations and you're just like, we did like a whole like.
Why do we need this?
Yes, like you're just being so extra. Like that doesn't even make sense. Like you're like, there's nothing that relates back to that. Like you were just bored one day and you just came up with it. And I'm just like, goodness. So I do appreciate when you're like, oh, like that makes sense,
I think one of the weird things about acronyms is when you hear people like pronounce some of them and not other ones.
Oh my God. How do you say data? Data or data? How do you do it? Say it.
I do data.
I do data too.
But is data plural or singular?
But when I read the memes, I say it both ways in my head. Like when you see them.
I heard someone spell out SQL instead of saying SQL. And I was like, whoa.
I've done that before.
That's a thing. Or like GUI is a common one that like people pronounce instead, like CRUD, right? Like you're not going to say CRUD. That'd be a weird. Like.
But it's weird because you say these things in your head when you're studying and when you're reading off the internet for so long. And then you don't think about how you would say it in a conversation. And then my brain's like, oh, wait, like,
The only difference between an audiobook and like a physical book when you're reading it is the fact that like in the audiobook, you know how to pronounce all the names.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So my next one is asynchronous IO. So it's a more efficient way for a system to use resources. And it's a form of input-output processes that permit it to process and continue before something finishes. Kind of in the same realm of functionality of ACID, but different, but just making sure that you get through a whole process and the process has done what it's supposed to do.
In async specifically, like you don't want to block. Like, don't stop everything to let this happen. Just like,
exactly. And it's also like going in the right order. So that's important too. Like you want to make sure that you're hitting all the things in the right order and it finishes and completes before you start again, so.
I didn't really like IO in there is like another acronym. That's just like, cause you don't say.
Yeah. Input and output.
Yeah. You don't say asynchronous input and output. Like it's async IO and AIO.
It's an acronym and an acronym. So AIO is asynchronous IO, but yeah. And then object relational mapping. This is something that you typically use with a SQL database, and it's usually like kind of a tool to help like query things. So usually like they'll have like MySQL Workbench or like something that helps you to query.
An ORM tool that lets you visualize it, like those relationships.
Yeah. But so it's like a query tool that helps you to query a SQL database. So it's kind of like a bridge between the two, I guess.
Is it generating the SQL itself typically, or is it making that relationship in the tool itself because it's directly connected to the database, or is it like I have to map this out and then go query it somewhere else?
It helps developers to interact with the relational database, but I'm honestly not sure on that level how it does it, to be honest.
I know some of them will connect live, but also like, are you doing that to production? Are you like, do you have read write access?
I think there's like NoSQL databases don't need that because of the way that they connect like straight to an application, but don't quote me.
All right. That's fine. I won't quote you because you're on the podcast, so you're recorded. So thanks everyone for listening to today's show. We hope that you enjoyed it. Again, if you have someone that you would like to hear on the show, or you would like to be on the show, or topics that you're interested in, feel free to email us at shipit@changelog.com. We do read all the emails. I think I'm a little bit behind on responding, but we will get to them for sure at some point, because we love hearing from you, and we want to know what you're interested in, and even just how the show's going for you. This is, I don't remember, our 6th or 7th episode after the reboots, and we're still finding our groove in some things, but overall having a lot of fun.
Oh, wait, I figured it out. Okay, I Googled it. It's like SQL alchemy. Oh, I love that with Python and Django and stuff. I love using that to connect your database and get to do all the things that you want. It's awesome.
So thanks everyone again, and we will talk to you again, or we'll be talking at you next week.
Hopefully we get to interview some cool people at scale. I'm excited.
Yeah. All right, bye.
Thanks for listening to Ship It with Justin Garrison and Autumn Nash. Subscribe now if you haven't already. Head to shipit.show for all the ways, or just search for Ship It wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find us. Thanks once again to our partners at Fly.io, to the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder for these dope beats.
Oh yeah, my pleasure.
And to Sentry. Use code CHANGELOG when you sign up and save $100 off their team plan. That's all for now, but come back next week when we continue discussing everything that happens after Git Push.